World War II. I want to bring you guys up to date with a look at what America is like in 1938. So there's a lot of obviously important issues that are emerging, not only on the American stage and the world stage, and of course, as we know it, the following year, World War II is going to break out. But before we get to the outbreak of war, it's necessary to give you some insight into where America stood as far as their perspective on war. And that was in a largely isolationist environment. If you remember from our conversation last week, following World War I, the United States refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and ends up, of course, not being able to join the League of Nations, which was the only component of the 14 points that Wilson fully got into the treaty. Excuse me. And much of this is a result of the fact that Americans never again want to be dragged into a solely European conflict. Still, the United States couldn't completely avoid what was happening on the world stage. One of the biggest issues that was driving America's isolationism and kind of interactions at the same time on the world stage was war debt. Many of the Allied powers were unable to pay back the loans that they had taken out from America during World War I to purchase war supplies or to pay back the debts that they had incurred on credit in buying those supplies. And of course, the Americans expected those loans to be paid back because much of that money that was being used to pay back the debt would be used to then build up the American military. Unfortunately, the tariff situation exacerbated the difficulty of Europeans to pay back the debt as well, because they were unable to sell goods to American consumers at reasonable prices to put money in their own coffers to then pay that debt back. The French and the British, of course, were expecting reparations from Germany at that time. We talked about under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to solely accept blame for the war, and that they were responsible for paying back a stifling amount, or paying, I should say, a stifling amount of war reparation, nearly $13 billion, to the Allied powers, largely France and Germany, to pay for the loss of life and damage to the territories that the Germans had supposedly incurred. And then, of course, with the onset of the Great Depression, the entire structure of repayment collapses. Not only does the Great Depression affect the United States, but it ultimately will become a worldwide depression, and it's going to hit the Germans perhaps the hardest of all. At one point in time, the German Reichsmark was devalued 4.5 trillion to $1 US. And people literally had to take wheelbarrows full of money to the store just to buy a loaf of bread. It was more productive to burn your money for, warmth than it was to use it to buy firewood. That's how bad the situation was. So if we thought it was bad in the United States, it was even worse in Germany. Many Americans, though, despite the fact that the situation was escalating worldwide in the realm of the Depression, were still concerned about disarmament. Many individuals in our Congress thought that limitations on arms would bring lasting peace, but that goes against the economic production that many countries were hoping would pull them out of the Depression. And it also ran counter to the threat that was emerging from Asia. And that was, of course, the threat of the Japanese. The Japanese during this time period are getting increasingly hungry for more territory. And in 1931, they invade Chinese Manchuria successfully and overtake that territory, giving them a foothold on mainland Asia, which is certainly a cause for concern. Despite the brokerage of numerous treaties during this time period, the Japanese seem very unwilling to accept long-lasting terms and ultimately withdraw from all agreements in 1934 with a staunch desire to expand their military. Still, along the way, Americans still hold hope for lasting peace. One of the biggest visions for abolishing warfare forever was culminated in the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, which was negotiated between the French Foreign Minister Briand and our Secretary of State Kellogg. But ultimately what it did was an attempt to draw Americans indirectly into future European conflict. However, Kellogg turned the tables on Briand and insisted that all powers in the world sign on to the treaty. And when this then came to fruition with the major world powers, Japan included, the French were a bit more stymied and less able to bring the United States into European problems than they hoped, because it would have promised the French to then get involved in North American and Asian problems, which they did not want to do. And so ultimately the Kellogg-Briand Pact would be one of the first major failures moving into the 1930s. We're also still struggling at this time with the concept of the good neighbor policy, which we also talked about last week and the week before. During this era, there are increased issues in Latin America centering around our relationships with the Panama Canal, Nicaragua, as well as with Cuba. In fact, Herbert Hoover embarks on a tour of Latin America in an attempt to negotiate with some of the governments that were currently in place there, which was quite counter to the policies of many of his predecessors, who basically told these foreign nations in Latin America that we were in charge and our way was the only way. Hoover took a different tactic and attempted to negotiate with some of them. However, when FDR came into office, he basically said that we would no longer continue those policies and would continue to abide by the Monroe Doctrine. In the end, unfortunately, all of these moves are not going to prepare us for what is going to occur, and that is further expansion of militaristic efforts in Asia and Europe. A moment ago, I mentioned that Japan kind of kicks things off in 1931 with their invasion of Manchuria. This Manchurian incident violated numerous treaties the Japanese were party to, including the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and also the Japanese signatory on the League of Nations. The Japanese were members of the League of Nations at that time, and as members of the League of Nations, they were not supposed to act as aggressors against any nation. And of course, this invasion violated that agreement. The Japanese claimed that the Chinese were at fault, because of course you always blame your enemy when you invade. And they said that they were justifying their occupation because the Chinese had blown up a railway line in Japan. This was definitely not true. What the reality of the matter was is that Japan wanted a foothold on the Asian continent and access to many of the resources, natural resources that were available in Manchuria. Ultimately, the League of Nations would condemn Japanese aggression in Manchuria. So Japan retaliated by withdrawing from the League. And then, as I mentioned, by 1934, pulling out of all other international agreements that they were a part of. Of course, simultaneously, while this is occurring, we're seeing the rise of fascism in Europe. Many people think of Adolf Hitler as the first fascist. That's actually not true. The first fascist was actually Benito Mussolini, who seized power in Italy and showed that an organized fascist movement could be successful. Fascism is a right-wing political philosophy that brings in elements of extreme nationalism to the point that people surrender to the will of the state in an attempt to bring forth progression through militarization. And of course, in 1933, on January 30th, 1933, the German counterpart to Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, comes into power. His Nazi party, or National Socialist German Workers' Party, which is not to be confused with the socialist movement, duplicates Mussolini's efforts. And when Hitler becomes chancellor in Germany, he gains a foothold that he does not release. The position of chancellor in Germany is kind of similar to that of our vice president in the United States. The chancellor is appointed, not elected. He's appointed by the president. And his role is to oversee the German Reichstag, or parliament. Typically, the chancellor is chosen as the member of the majority party, a senior ranking member of the majority party, which the Nazis barely were as of January of 1933. In fact, it's believed that had regular elections continued in Germany, the Nazis would have continued to lose seats in the Reichstag. But at that point in time, they were a disruptive political force. And in abiding by the old adage, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, President von Hindenburg, who had beaten Hitler in the 1932 presidential election, decided that he would appoint Hitler as his chancellor in order to control him. And we all, of course, know how well that worked out.
And that was what date?
January 30th, 1933.
Thank you.
So putting these two individuals in power, and then also with the eruption of the Spanish Civil War, which also was a fascist regime, by 1938, Europe's peace is significantly challenged. Hitler annexes Austria in March of 1938 in an event known as the Anschluss. And then that fall, he overtakes the Sudeten territory in Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland had been part of the German Empire prior to World War I, but with the Treaty of Versailles, when the major empires were broken up, that piece of land was taken and given to the new nation of Czechoslovakia. And so Hitler decides to take it back in the fall of 1939. This is now today viewed as one of the most significant diplomatic failures in history. At that point in time, Britain and France could have charged Germany with violating the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, they could have done so back in March when they annexed Austria, but Austria seemingly happened under a vote, a plebiscite by its citizens that they wanted to be absorbed by Germany. It's kind of hard, though, I think, to really vote with your heart when there's stormtroopers standing outside watching how you're voting. So with this militaristic takeover in the fall of 1939, there was absolutely no question in the fact that Britain and France could act against Hitler and Nazi Germany. And by this point in time, Hitler is the all-out leader of Germany. Von Hindenburg, who was incredibly old, he was in his 80s, maybe like 85 at that time, had died in August of 34. And instead of replacing him as president, Hitler combines the positions of president and chancellor into a position he called, of course, the Führer. And so, you know, he ends up in this position, and Britain and France basically operate under a policy of appeasement. They allow him to keep the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia as long as he promises not to do it again. Literally, that's basically how it goes down in the Munich Agreement in September of 1938. You can keep this, that was naughty, but you can keep that toy, but just promise you're not going to take any more. And of course, it's not going to get any better. The following spring, Hitler seizes remaining territory in Czechoslovakia, the Bohemian region. Mussolini conquers Albania in northern Africa. And then in September of 1939, following the signing of a non-aggression pact with Soviet Russia, Hitler invades Poland on September 1st. So where does this put all of the individuals who are coming under the realm of Adolf Hitler? One of the things that we've seen a lot about in the news in recent years is the refugee crisis that's happening today and its parallels to the refugee crisis of the 1930s. And as a nation, I think we've begun to recognize a little bit more some of the failures of refugee policy during this time period. In the 1930s, as a result of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, the American government issued visas to people based on a quota system. The quota system disproportionately favored people from Northern and Western Europe, people like the original settlers to America. It was tilted against Eastern European countries and Southern European countries, so Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Russians, etc. So when many of the people are attempting to flee Nazi Germany in the mid to late 1930s, they're unable to get visas into the United States, bless you, because even German Jews had to apply for visas based on their country, bless you, of origin. And because citizenship was stripped from many German Jews with the 1935 Nuremberg laws, and because many of those German Jews were also born in Poland and Russia, they were unable to get visas easily into the United States because of the fact that they were from Eastern European countries. And so we see a significant difficulty. And there's a really good film out there. I'm not going to have you guys watch it, but if you want to look for it on YouTube, it's called America and the Holocaust. The YouTube title, I think, is Apathetic America because it's a bootleg, but you can't access it from legal channels at this point in time, so you can find the bootleg, or if anybody wants to email me for the link, I'll gladly send it your way. In this film, it shows that the State Department was highly anti-Semitic during this time and purposely acted to prevent refugees from coming to America. And so I'm going to show you this really brief, it's 7 minutes, but it's worth watching, clip on refugee ships coming to the United States and the amount of Jews that actually did manage to escape Europe despite the very difficult situations that they found themselves in. It's going to focus also on two ships, one which has a direct link to the United States, or to Virginia. And so take a look at that now. I love this website, but it doesn't allow us to navigate it very easily. So here we go. So it's 7 minutes long. I'm going to just show you, I'm going to speed it up when we get partway through to focus on the experience of the St. Louis. So what are you noticing so far about the monthly flow of ships?
Increasing.
It's increasing. What else? All right. Wow, the number of refugees really went up. What happens in November of 1938? We just had the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, first outward act of violence against the Jewish population in Europe. So many more Jews are going to be leaving.
What's the name of it?
Kristallnacht, Crystal Night.
On May 13, 1939, the MS St. Louis, a German passenger ship, began its journey from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba. The ship carried 937 passengers. Most were Jews seeking temporary refuge in Cuba as they waited for immigration visas to the United States. When the ship arrived in Havana, most of the passengers were not allowed to disembark. They had unknowingly purchased fraudulent landing permits from a corrupt Cuban government official. The ship sat in the harbor for nearly 1 week while a relief agency called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, tried to persuade the Cuban government to admit the refugees. After negotiations broke down, the ship steered toward Miami, Florida. The refugees and their supporters on land appealed to the public, the press, and even to President Roosevelt and the First Lady. The president never responded, and the State Department did not take any measures to admit the St. Louis passengers. As the ship crossed the Atlantic on its return to Germany, the Joint's European director, Morris Troper, worked tirelessly with State Department staff in Western Europe to find safe havens for the passengers. Troper's last-ditch efforts were successful. 4 Western European countries, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, issued entry visas to the St. Louis passengers. They would not be forced to return to Nazi Germany. But the passengers were not safe from future danger because Nazi Germany soon invaded 3 of the countries where they had landed. Many of the passengers were still on the waiting list for U.S. immigration visas 1 year later. But immigration to the United States was nearly impossible. Of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis, 254 were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II.
Okay, so what are you noticing now about the number of ships? It's going down. Why?
Because if they're not able to get in, why are they gonna leave?
That's in part, but what else is going on?
They're not being allowed.
Not some of them are in concentration camps,
They're not being allowed to.
but keep in mind these are ships period leaving, like not necessarily just Jewish refugees. Why is the number of ships going down? What's that?
To support the war.
Well, yeah, and I mean, who wants to travel across the Atlantic when there's submarines out there that might bomb your ship?
In August 1940, the SS Kwanzaa sailed from Lisbon to New York, carrying more than 300 passengers. Most were Jewish refugees. Europe had been in war for nearly a year, and it was getting even harder for refugees to cross the Atlantic Ocean. 200 Kwanzaa passengers who held U.S. immigration visas disembarked in New York. The remaining passengers who did not have U.S. visas continued to Veracruz, Mexico. Mexico, however, claimed that at least 80 of the passengers did not have the right paperwork. Their admission was denied. When the Kwanzaa's passengers realized that the ship would stop in Norfolk, Virginia to refuel before returning to Lisbon, they sent frantic telegrams to family members, Jewish organizations, and the U.S. government. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed her personal interest in the fate of the refugees. One family on board hired Jacob Morwitz, a local Virginia attorney, who sued the shipping company for failing to deliver the passengers to their intended destination. Many other passengers also filed suits. A federal judge ordered the ship to stay in Norfolk while Morwitz's case was reviewed by the court. While the ship waited in Norfolk, the State Department investigated the remaining passengers. All were allowed to disembark in the United States. The Kwanzaa passengers sent letters of gratitude to the State Department and the White House, including flowers for the First Lady. But Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long was angry about being forced to admit refugees from the Kwanzaa. He made it clear to U.S. consulates in Europe that the State Department would not tolerate any further incidents in the future.
And now where are the ships leaving from too? What do you notice? What to Britain and Portugal? Why? Who's embroiled in the war by this point in time? The Germans have invaded France and the High Countries, so. We see an uptick with the onset of Operation Barbarossa. And then immigration essentially ends when Nazi Germany bans all immigration of Jews from its occupied lands, and that's when we're going to see the march towards the final solution. So it's believed that in total, maybe about 200,000 Jews made it out of Nazi-occupied Europe to the United States. The numbers shown on that particular video just go off of people who listed Hebrew as their nationality on the ship's manifest. But we know that many Jews from Western Europe didn't consider themselves to be Hebrew or to be Jewish. They considered themselves to be German or Czechoslovakian or so on and so forth. And so that's why we estimate a higher number than what that actual video shows. But I think it's still pretty interesting to think about the fact that people were able to get out, but that the United States government largely was not receptive to their immigration, even though they were by that point in time fleeing a regime that was known to heavily persecute them. If you look back at newspapers from this time period, you'll see that as of right now, the Stanton News Leader had half a dozen articles talking about the St. Louis. They, prior to that, to June of 1939, they had numerous other articles, probably at least 50 in total, regarding the mistreatment of European Jews by Nazi Germany. And so people, even in a small town like Stanton, which did not have a very significantly large Jewish community at that time, still knew what was happening in Europe. And so when we think about that and we think about American attitudes towards immigrants during this time period, it's pretty interesting. So thinking back now to the war itself, it begins on September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invade Poland under the premise that a Polish group of troops had attacked a German radio station in the Danzig corridor. And of course, that is a false narrative. And it's simply an excuse, again, thinking back to the fact that you always need a scapegoat for the Wehrmacht to rapidly invade Poland in what is known as a blitzkrieg or lightning war. Poland is overtaken quite rapidly and surrenders very quickly because they are outflanked and outnumbered by the German military. By the spring of the following year, Denmark and Norway have fallen, and the French are also ultimately overtaken. The French fall so quickly that many individuals in France actually believed that it was as a result of a supposed fifth column, as they called them, which they believed were traitors and spies within the French government. And now Britain is standing alone as the only really truly free Allied power in Western Europe. Of course, it's very challenging for the British to resist the German Air Force because they are going to begin rapidly bombing in what will be known as the bombing of Britain, the whole island nation of Great Britain. And it's at that point that Churchill begins to implore for the assistance of President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt, though, of course, does not want to get us actively involved in another war in Europe. And you're going to read more extensively about this at home this week. But one of the things that he will ultimately do after signing several neutrality acts is he will begin to funnel military supplies to the British. But before he gets to that point, he has to be reelected. And so now comes the conundrum. No president in our history, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, Germany invaded Poland.
September 1st, 1939. No president in American history has ever run for a third term, and no president in American history has ever been elected to a third term. And so Roosevelt, feeling an obligation to remain at the helm of American society now that war has broken out in Europe, makes the decision to run. And his opponent will be Wendell Willkie, who was a former Democrat who fought against the New Deal. And the Republicans, actually initially had wanted to support Willkie as their candidate, but ultimately settle on Robert Taft. And so it becomes a three-man race. And it's quite likely, as a result of the fact that it is a three-man race, that the Republicans will lose. And Roosevelt wins his narrowest victory of the four times, that he'll run for president, but it's enough to keep him in office. And so as a result of this, in the spring of 1941, the American Institute of Public Opinion does not believe that the United States should declare war on Germany. A resounding 93% of them say no. However, Roosevelt finds another way to help, bless you, and that is by passing the Lend-Lease Act. The premise of the Lend-Lease Act and the way that it did not violate our neutrality outright was that it allowed us to lend military supplies to the Allied powers in exchange for leases on bases in Allied territories. So it was an exchange. It was not an exchange of funds. It was an exchange of supplies and bases. And theoretically, under Lend-Lease, we could have also brokered the same deal with the Axis powers, but we claimed to not have interest in any of the bases that they could potentially offer us. So therefore, it is going to benefit, of course, the British. At this time, the war is expanding. Italy has officially joined as Germany's ally. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria have as well. And so the British are in pretty desperate need of help. At this time, Roosevelt and Churchill also have a secret meeting in August of 1941, where they draw up a statement of principles known as the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter, among other things, basically says that if for any reason the United States is drawn into war, the British will have their back, and vice versa. And of course, as we know, in 1941, Japanese aggression will ultimately bring us there. But before we get to that, we need to back up a little bit. So heading into the late 1930s, into the early 1940s, the United States relations with Japan take a turn for the worse. The Japanese continue to attempt to overtake territories in what at that time is known as French Indochina, areas like Vietnam and Cambodia. They begin to construct airfields in this region, and they also sign the Tripartite Pact, which puts them in alliance with Germany and Italy, all major red flags to the United States. So Roosevelt decides to take 3 steps in response to what he views are acts of aggression by the Japanese. First, he freezes all Japanese assets in the United States. He freezes all Japanese assets in the United States. Secondly, he restricts oil exports to the Japanese. And third, he restricts steel exports to the Japanese. Japan, again, small island nation, doesn't have access to oil, doesn't have much ability to manufacture steel, depends on these things from the United States. And so the embargo of these 2 items is going to royally tick them off. However, Roosevelt was not completely firm in the embargo. He was willing to negotiate with the Japanese if they were willing to let go of certain territorial holds that they had made. And it's actually during a period of time when Roosevelt felt that the negotiations were moving forward that, of course, we have the day that will live in infamy. December 7th, 1941, surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And that, of course, is going to bring the United States into the war. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they were unsuccessful in bombing the onshore facilities of the American military. They were largely targeting the port area. They also missed the oil tanks that helped to supply the fuel for the United States Pacific Fleet. And they also missed our aircraft carriers, which were out to sea. And so although Pearl Harbor was certainly a significant tragedy that cost the lives of over 2,400 Americans, for the Japanese, it would ultimately be a failure. It would end American neutrality and bring us into war, not only against the Japanese, but also against the other Axis powers, because several days later, Germany declares war on the United States to show support for the Japanese. And then we end up declaring war on Germany and then subsequently Italy as well. So now the United States needs to officially mobilize. We need to get troops together, a process that had actually begun the previous September, in September of 1940, when Roosevelt passed the Selective Service Act, AKA the draft, the first and only time a peacetime draft was actually brought forth in the United States. We also have to decide on our strategy. Are we going to focus on the Pacific? Are we going to focus on the European theater? Or are we going to spread resources across both? The immediate response in the Pacific is that of aircraft carriers and airplanes. It is not going to be with troops on the ground. And we actually, in 1942, in the first 6 months of 1942, fight a series of successful battles via aircraft carrier and airplane. The most notable, of course, being the Battle of Midway, which is going to prevent further Japanese encroachment towards the United States, and ultimately will lead us into a series of leapfrogging missions, which will take us closer and closer to the main Japanese islands. We decide that actually what we're really going to do with our troops is focused on defeating Hitler first. That becomes the mantra. And we broker a deal not only with the British, but also now with the Soviet Union, who as of June of 1941 is an enemy of Hitler following his invasion of the Soviet Union, that if we defeat Hitler first, the British and the Russians will help us then defeat the Japanese if that objective is not achieved simultaneously. One of the benefits, of course, of us jumping into war is that it's going to officially end the Great Depression. Wartime production. I somehow screwed up this slide for you guys. Wartime production is going to ultimately allow us to bring the nation out of the Great Depression, and then also going to allow us to put women in the workforce to fill in for the men that were sent off to war. And it's through this campaign to bring women into the workforce that we get Rosie the Riveter. And we also get a movement towards changing roles of women in society. And while when we get to the 1950s, we're going to see that movement wane for a little while, we're going to see it come back with a vengeance in the 1960s. Unfortunately, in the United States, equality was still not yet recognized and realized. African Americans were forced to serve in segregated military units, one of the most famous, of course, being the Tuskegee Airmen. Asian Americans were also segregated. We see the creation of the Japanese internment camps, which were supported by over 90% of Americans who believed that the Japanese were the enemy, particularly along the Western seaboard. And over 50% of Americans even supported interning Japanese who were fully American citizens and born in the United States. Other Asian Americans did enlist, despite this discrimination, in the American Armed Forces and served in what were called the Nisei regiments, N-I-S-E-I. and they too would ultimately play a significant role in American military success. But the first place that we put boots on the ground is going to be in North Africa. North Africa is actually in the far reaches of the European theater. And we're going to end up there in the fall of 1942 because we need to give our American troops some experience before we actually send them deep into the European theater against the Nazi Wehrmacht. The successes of going into North Africa first are going to allow us to cut off valuable oil supplies from the Germans while they're simultaneously being beaten at Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. We're also overtaking valuable territory and gaining time to continue to build up our troops as well as our naval forces. As we move into 1943, British and US troops begin landing in Italy and working their way up from the bottom of Europe. And our naval forces also begin to have significant victories in the Atlantic. It's at this time that strategic bombing begins on the European mainland, and planning begins to occur for what's initially called Operation Bolero. Anybody know what Operation Bolero will ultimately become? June 6, 1944, D-Day. Yep. So as progress is being made, both on the Eastern Front with the successes at Stalingrad and with the strategic bombing in Europe, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt meet with Joseph Stalin in Tehran, Iran, in what is known as the Tehran meeting. The significance, what's that? Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt meet in Tehran. And what's really significant about this is that they not only agree on what will become D-Day, but they also agree to officially fight together against the Japanese. And lastly, following the war, they agree to create a new international organization that will become the United Nations. So, as we begin to draw the evening to a close, D-Day, of course, being what many Americans view as the significant turning point of the European theater, takes place on June 6, 1944. And I'm just going to show you this brief overview of it. I think you're all sick of Radford University at this point.
After months of preparation and deception, Eisenhower launches his attack against German-occupied France. 150,000 ground troops, jammed onto hundreds of small landing craft, leave England and cross the English Channel. They'll land at 5 different beaches in France, codenamed Juno, Sword, Gold, Utah, and Omaha. As the landing craft approach the beaches, 15,000 aircraft and 7,000 ships provide a coordinated aerial assault on the beaches. At some of the landing sites, the Allied soldiers meet very little resistance. But at beaches like Omaha, it's hell on earth. For many of the Allied soldiers inside the landing craft, these moments before the door opens will be their last.
A case of incredible courage in the face of overwhelming horror. I mean, if you think about it, the landing crafts came up to the beach, And as they came up to the beach, the troops inside the landing craft could hear the machine guns tapping on the outside. The Army machine guns switched to FCL, Final Coordination Line. They're going to put as much machine gun fire on the front of that boat, so when it drops, bullets go right through and kill 2 or 3 guys at a time. A lot of guys just die that way.
Many don't make it off the boats. For the soldier lucky enough to survive the initial machine gun barrage, the nightmare is just beginning. He then has to cross 200 yards of mined tidal flats, weighed down with wet, heavy gear. Then get through another 100 yards of barbed wire beaches. It's 3 football fields of death and destruction as German machine guns shred fellow soldiers and friends.
If you ever get a chance to visit Omaha, it will change your whole view about the world. It will change your whole view about America. It will make you realize what incredible heroism was displayed by those guys there.
The Allies survive on dead ground by fighting together and never giving up.
Well, you know, I mean, a situation where much fighting done, and they fought well, and they survived.
Through bravery and determination, the troops are able to take all 5 landing sites at Normandy.
Despite all of the complex planning that went into the invasion of Normandy, it was the small unit tactics and the buddies fighting side by side that wins the battle of the beaches, and that's consistent throughout history.
So it's a pretty amazing victory from a tactical standpoint, a strategic standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint for many Americans. And it will ultimately lead to the downfall of Germany. And it's really the movement at D-Day that liberates Europe from Hitler. Unfortunately, with that liberation, we discover the fact that the Germans have been perpetrating a mass genocide against their Jewish citizens and other Jews in occupied territories that will ultimately cost the lives of over 6 million individuals that are Jewish and 5 million others. I was going to show you a short video on it from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, but you'll have the opportunity this week at home to view a more extensive piece on it. So I'm going to skip this for now. As a result of D-Day and the dominoes that fall after the fact, within 11 months, the war in Europe finally draws to a close. But before, we get to that point, Theodore Roosevelt, all of a sudden, Franklin Roosevelt is up for a 4th term, and he is successfully elected. And unfortunately, he will die 3 months after he's sworn into office in April of 1945. Guess it's getting late, I need more caffeine. In April of 1945, upon Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman is sworn in as the next president of the United States. And it is under Truman that we negotiate the final terms of the post-war world. Much of this is actually done several months prior in February of 1945 at the conference in Yalta, Y-A-L-T-A. At the conference in Yalta, official plans are made to move forward, bless you, in the aftermath of the war in Europe. One of the terms that is reached there, and this is actually where this photograph is taken of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, is that the liberating forces will not remain in the countries that they liberate, which is something that we're going to definitely come back to you next week when we start the Cold War, because Russia is going to violate that to the extreme. And that's ultimately what will embroil us in the Cold War. But even though the war in Europe officially draws to a close in May of 1945, the war in the Pacific still rages on. By the end of 1944, Allied forces are essentially within range of mainland Japan. However, they are unable to successfully reach the main island of Japan without recognizing that a significant loss of life will occur. And so a few different maneuvers are made, one of which takes us towards the Philippines, and another which will ultimately land us on Tokyo, while Admiral Nimitz is also proposing an additional naval sweep throughout the Pacific Islands. In what will become known as the Battle of Bismarck Sea, the Japanese will be struck one of their final blows when the American bombers sink the vast majority of the Japanese ships and also kill the head admiral of the Japanese Navy, a gentleman by the name of Admiral Yamamoto, whose name you do not need to spell. And so therefore, the Japanese know that an end is likely in sight. However, they are unwilling to surrender. And it is this unwillingness that will ultimately lead in August of 1945 to the dropping of not one, but 2 atomic bombs. This is what Truman will call the most difficult decision he ever had to make in his entire life. The atomic bomb project had begun in 1940. It was dubbed the Manhattan Project to keep it secret. And the bomb itself was actually assembled at a series of top secret facilities throughout the United States. They did not want to manufacture any one component of the bomb in conjunction with another in the event that the information would get out. And ultimately 2 bombs would be assembled for military use. The initial target was Hiroshima, which was the assembly point for the Japanese Navy. And they were hoping that by bombing Hiroshima, that the Japanese government would recognize that they had a lost cause and that they would surrender. Unfortunately, the Japanese did not cave to the dropping of the first bomb, which killed approximately 80,000 people on immediate detonation, and then hundreds of thousands of others in days and years to come as a result of the radiation. And so a second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki. And after that point, the Japanese decided that the war was no longer worth fighting, and the Japanese emperor accepted terms of surrender under the condition that he could retain his emperorship, which surprisingly the Allied powers allowed him to do. So the war in the Pacific finally ends in August of 1945. And I'm going to skip that video as well. Ultimately, World War II would be the costliest conflict ever undertaken in world history. It would have profound effects on American life and society. It would certainly positively end the Great Depression and lead to new technologies and new opportunities for women and African Americans. But our fight for civil rights for all was not yet over. The Democratic Party benefited from the war effort and solidified its control of the White House and Congress. However, we will see some of the downsides of the expansion of federal government that occur. It also puts the United States in a new era in the world arena and will ultimately launch us into the Cold War, and also will put us into the arena of kind of delegating and relegating human rights throughout the world. And that's something we're still struggling with today. So as you pack up tonight, we do have our Socrative. It is ready to go. Disregard the by 12-2. That was from an old class, but do make sure that you knock out the test sometime in the next 2 weeks. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me. And I hope all of you guys have a great Thanksgiving holiday. And that you get some rest and relaxation and some downtime. So.